Good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Before we start, just want to mention that this webinar is being recorded. My name is Pablo Valverde. I'm Deputy CEO at the International Hydropower Association. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to welcome all of you to this webinar. Now, those of you who are joining us for the first time, joining one of our webinars for the first time, just very quickly on who we are. We're an organization that works to promote and give a global voice to sustainable hydropower. That's not large hydro, that's not small hydro, that's not pump storage, that's sustainable hydropower. We believe that sustainable hydropower is a clean, green, modern, affordable solution to climate change. But we also believe that going forward, the only acceptable hydropower is sustainable hydropower. And we do this work thanks to the support from our members who collectively work in over 120 countries and represent 1/3 of the global installed hydropower capacity. Now, for the last 9 years, we've been tracking and publishing an annual report on the status of the hydropower industry. And this is our flagship report. It's based on what we believe to be the most complete database of hydropower projects out there. But you'll see, however, that this webinar is not called the World Hydropower Status webinar, it's World Hydropower Outlook. And that's because it's becoming increasingly important, more important than ever, to look forward. And we'll be hearing today from our speakers how we need to double our capacity, our hydropower capacity in the next 30 years. And that if we do not, we'll not be able to meet net zero. It's as simple as that. So it's important that we look forward, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. You see on your slides, on your screens, we'll be first having a introduction to the World Hydropower Outlook, New Developments and Opportunities from Alex Campbell at the International Hydropower Association. Then we'll be looking at insights from the REN 21 Renewables Global Status Report from Rana Adib. And then hydropower's role in net zero pathways from Yasmina Abdelilah from the IEA. And then we'll look at, put the spotlight on pumped storage, and that'll be presented by Rebecca Ellis, also from IHA. There will also be an opportunity for asking questions at the end. But in the meantime, please do post your questions to panelists in the Q&A section on Zoom. If you can't find it, let us know. We can see, you should be able to find it on the bottom part of your screen, the Q&A. Do please post your questions and we'll have an opportunity to discuss them live at the end of the interventions. And we'll be posting, and you might have seen that my colleagues have already done this in the chat. We'll be posting useful links in the chat. And as you know, the webinar will be recorded. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to hand over to Alex Campbell, our Head of Research and Policy at IHA. Alex, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Pablo. And as Pablo said, this is the 9th edition of our status report. Hopefully you've all had a chance to take a look, but if not, we'll go through some of the headline findings and just some important points to note, of course, with hydropower. The way it's built and put together means that we get quite a lumpy deployment. So some years we might get a few massive projects, other years they might only be halfway through. So we tend to look at things on a rolling basis, so a kind of 5-year average. So the real top level headlines this year, we're now up to 1,360 gigawatts of capacity, with around, we think, 26 gigawatts added last year. It really does depend on quite how you account when projects are commissioned and so on. So these are kind of ballpark figures. We think they're in roughly the right place, but of course, as I say, exactly how when you count a project coming online does make a difference to the year it's attributed to. That 26 gigawatts is up on that rolling 5-year average that I talked about of 22 gigawatts. But of course, as I say, it really can depend year on year due to, whether a project comes online in December or January, most obviously. Really important point to note, which I'll come back to, is that China has very much led the way last year with 21 gigawatts of that new capacity. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Just diving into those headline numbers in a little bit more detail, we think that overall generation was down this year from hydropower. So hydropower still produces a huge amount of the world's electricity, full stop, 15–16%, more than the other renewables or nuclear at present, although of course we expect that to change in the case of wind and solar over the coming decades. And I'm sure Rana will have something to say on how wind and solar are being deployed. But nonetheless, that's still, you know, we're talking about far more than the European Union's total electricity demand, for example, each year. Pump storage hit 165 gigawatts, we think, with around, well, just under 5 gigawatts being deployed last year. Again, that is driven in large part by when you actually count the new capacity coming on. According to some statistics, some of that 5 gigawatts was in 2020. So the headline figure, the important point there is that we're now about 165 gigawatts of pump storage. If we could go to the next slide, please. So just a brief overview of some of the bigger projects that were commissioned in 2021. And just going back to that point I was making about deploying capacity in stages, what you'll probably notice is a lot of these were additions to existing projects, whether it's in Laos or in China, that huge 6 gigawatts at Baitan, for example, or in Canada, even in the Ukraine. We've seen lots of quite significant additions rather than necessarily completely new projects. If we can go to the next slide, please. Just a quick point to note that we've had some major additions this year already as well, and obviously we'll be talking about those in a bit more detail next year rather. Major projects dotted around the world, including many of you will have seen Nantes de Trance in Switzerland just earlier this month, which was quite an exciting deployment in Europe, because obviously we're seeing a lot of the new capacity coming on in Asia. So it's good to see Europe and Africa picking up some new capacity as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And just to note again, some big projects in Bhutan, India and Pakistan expected to commission later on this year. So hopefully we'll see a real boost in the numbers next year as well. Next slide, please. I made the point right at the beginning, and I just illustrate it again with a graph. I think this makes it quite stark. When we think about what the world needs in respect of hydropower, and I'm sure Yasmina will talk about this later on, hydropower has a really important role in those low carbon electricity grids of the future. That deployment that we need to see something like 30 to 40 gigawatts each year. We're only seeing a little bit over 20 gigawatts, and the vast majority of that is coming from China. So there's some real challenges there if hydropower is going to play its really important role on those electricity systems of the future going up to 2050. Next slide, please. Just a further bit of breakdown on deployment globally. So hopefully, as you can see here, perhaps no surprises, some of the biggest countries in the world also have their largest hydropower fleets, whether it's China, Brazil, US, Canada, through to Russia and Japan and India as well, at around 50 gigawatts. And just those top 4 countries alone have more than half of the world's capacity. But we're not developing, as I said, at the pace that's needed. And Yasmina's analysis with the IEA suggests that we need at least 850 more gigawatts by around 2050, perhaps far more, to get down to that net zero target of just 1.5 degrees. And we've looked at the pipeline for hydropower, and we've seen around 130 gigawatts is under construction, which is good, and maybe 430, maybe more, that's been announced or is undergoing regulatory approvals. But that's still leaving a significant gap, as it says there, just, you know, a 300 gigawatt gap just to hit the 2-degree target, a much bigger gap if we're talking about 1.5 degrees. So it's really critical, we think, that those enabling mechanisms are in place to get that additional hydropower being planned for and then built. Next slide, please. So a good question that's always asked is, you know, have all the good sites already been taken with hydropower? We've looked at the scientific evidence, we've looked at the reports that have been done by a huge number of analysts and researchers, and what's clear is there is still a significant amount of potential out there. This chart is from our Hydropower 2050 report from last year, and what you can hopefully see is that the pipeline is quite small, but it's actually not that far off compared to the remaining capacity that there's potentially out there. We've got that there, you know, and this is a mixture of theoretical potential, but also economically viable potential and environmentally sustainable potential. And as you can hopefully see, there are many parts of the world, in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, where there is a huge amount of potential, more than enough for us to hit those targets so that hydropower can play its really important role in hitting net zero. So that was just a quick overview. I think that's the last slide for me. If we want to jump on to the next one, please, Alex. Just remind myself. Yes, indeed. So I'll hand back to you, Pablo, to pass over to Rana. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry. There you go. Thank you very much. And before I do pass on, just a quick note that you can all help shape our work for future reports by answering a one question survey that'll pop up on your screens at the end of this webinar. So with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce Rana Adib, who's the Executive Director of REN21, the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st Century. And as many of you already know, REN21 is the only global renewable energy community of actors from science, governments, NGOs, and industries, and they're headquartered at the United Nations Environment Programme in Paris, France. With that, can I check that you are with us, Rana?
Yes,
Please,
I'm with you.
Over to you. Excellent. Well, then I'll pass on to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for the introduction. And can you just confirm you can see my slides?
I confirm. I can see them.
Excellent. Perfect. Yeah, and thanks, Pablo, for introducing REN21. So I will remove this part from the starting point. From my side, you will hear a bit like the hydropower part in the overall renewable energy context. So REN21 is producing every year the Renewables Global Status Report. Just a month ago, we produced a 2022 edition, which is looking at renewable energy in the year 2021. But also, especially given the current geopolitical situation, the beginning of the year too. So when we're looking at 2021, and I think that is really something to clearly keep in mind, there has been a promise of a green recovery. And this is something which is materialized, obviously, by the increase in net zero commitments in 2021. So you also see that the world is basically covered in green, so to say, when we're looking at the ambition. And that is definitely something which is important. We also see, and Yasmina is going to give this perspective, certainly also from IEA side with the net zero scenario, that lots of players are really moving in that direction. And the norm has shifted here. So we are good on the ambition side. We can certainly do better, but what it's about now is to close the ambition action gap. So I think one part which we have also seen when we are looking at the national policies and status of implementation of renewable energy targets, and that we have 135 countries that do have a net zero policy. However, when we're looking into the amount of countries that have, for instance, 100% economy-wide renewable energy target, so where it is not about 100% renewable electricity, but 100% renewable energy, we only have 38 countries basically here. Another aspect too is that much of this ambition is basically not always so. It means that the net zero ambition is not always directly translated into the energy strategies and ambition on the strategy side, where there it is reducing the demand or also increasing basically renewable energy uptake. What we've also observed in 2021 is the question, do we have a collapse of the fossil fuel system? Admittedly, with the invasion of Ukraine, we clearly see that energy security and sovereignty are so much on the forefront that the trends we saw in 2021, there is a real question around it. However, when we look at this, we clearly see fossil fuels responsible for 75% of the CO2 emission, has major health impacts. 12.5 million people died due to outdoor and indoor air pollution, and has a massive economic impact. And that is clearly something where renewable energy is offering answers. So a high volatility of energy prices. This generates clearly windfall profits for fossil fuel players. but it also leads to the fact that billions of people are facing energy poverty. So there is very clearly an economic question, but also a societal question here, what to favor and what to support. Obviously, energy security, sovereignty questions. And the reality is, however, and I think that is something to just underline, and this was before government's responses to basically the energy price crisis, the inflation, etc., that fossil fuel continue to be subsidized massively, $11 million per minute. Now, let's see this energy system check. So it clearly means like we need, for environmental reasons, economic reasons, to leave the fossil fuel era and move into a sustainable renewable-based era. Let's see where we stand here. And I think this is the other good and very positive message of 2021. Again, in 2021, there were record additions in renewable power. And this is in particular driven by solar photovoltaics uptake and wind uptake. So I think that is really positive because it shows that we have here 315 gigawatt installed, an annual growth of 17%. And basically in terms of installed capacities, but it's also to mention that the electricity demand has grown by 6%. Now, when we're looking, for instance, however, at the IEA net zero scenario, or also average net zero scenarios for 2050, so a mix between the different scenarios out there, IEA, Rana, etc. The reality is that we must triple basically the installed capacities to reach those scenarios. And it's not in a long time, but during the next 8 years. And that is something I refer to the ambition action gap here, where we clearly see a massive gap. Another aspect to keep in mind, I think, is we tend to speak about power very much. But the reality is basically we have like the overall energy system. And when you look at the overall energy system, we see that the share basically of fossil fuel has not evolved. And I'll refer to 2009 and 2019 because 2020 is basically an exceptional, it's not showing a trend because we had COVID here. But we see basically that the share of renewables has increased from 8.7 to 11.7%, but at the same time, the share of fossil fuel has been stagnating. And this means we are consuming more fossil fuel than ever. Now, I think one thing which is really interesting when we're looking at the 2020 figure is that we see that the interplay of energy saving, energy efficiency, and renewables does work here, because reducing the energy demand, which was basically happening just because of the COVID lockdowns, has increased the share of renewable energy. So it is very clear that moving forward, we need to build on each other's strengths here, saving, efficiency, and renewables. On the right part of the slide, you see that hydropower in terms of growth was responsible for 3.9% basically of the energy demand, whereas the other renewables, biofuels and transferred biomass, geothermal, solar PV, wind, ocean were 2.8%. However, the growth is clearly happening very much on the solar PV and wind side. A very quick note here without going into detail. Again, we speak about the power part. This is the right-hand side, but power only represents 17% of the total final energy demand. Here we have a share of renewable energy of 28%. Heating and cooling and transport represent over 80%. And here we have a share of 11.2%. So in heating and cooling, which is basically buildings and industry, and in transportation, 3.7%. This clearly means that those sectors need a massive attention. And obviously power also plays a big role here with the electrification trends happening. I think stepping back also means like, where do we stand when we look at the overall energy system? Where do we stand globally? Because we are speaking about global targets, but ultimately it's also what is the situation at the country level, because this is where policies are basically being implemented to. We see that there are only 3 countries that have a share of renewable energy in their total final energy consumption of more than 50%. These are Iceland, Finland, and Sweden. And the reality here is that those countries have very much also addressed, so obviously there are resources existing in those countries, But they, as a result, they also address, for instance, the electrification of the transport sectors, addressing the heating sector, and this is clearly guiding away. Now, you can say like fossil fuel, so the question is, did the fossil fuel era end in 2021? Do we have a clear sign that we are entering the renewable energy era? There is something to mention here, which I think is really important at the forefront. We're not speaking about the technology choice only. We are speaking about renewable energy as that allows us to address not only the climate situation, but also questions of energy security, energy sovereignty, economic questions, other types of governance. So there are actually a diversity of benefits, and we see that the drivers are also building on this. One clear driver has, however, very clearly been the renewable energy cost. Today, when we're looking into renewable power, renewables is the least cost option basically to produce power. And as a result, that is something which is has been a key driver, has been also a key driver, for instance, for corporate energy consumers to really invest in renewable energy capacities, just as an example. So we also see other types of players basically entering the renewable energy market. On the electrification trends, just in the context of hydropower, I think it's really interesting to see. We see obviously an electrification trend in the transport sector, especially when we're looking at road transportation. Here you see, like, only as an example, the electric car global stock, the uptake, with basically electric car sales tripling between 2019 and doubling basically from 2021, tripling from 2019. So there is an exponential part which clearly shows that power and power demand will increase also from that front. We see a similar trend on the electrification trends. Here it's like the heat pump developments, but now in the beginning of 2022, we see a massive increase, basically, especially in the European market of heat pumps. And all this is also raising a real question about how is the renewable energy industry able to deliver on this demand? So the attention here is also moving away from only like the energy system, but to clear industrial policies, industrial strategies, manufacturing questions, and also questions of technology sovereignty. And then on the role of hydropower, obviously, just to give an aspect, with the development and the drive from solar PV and wind, we clearly have an increasing share of variable renewable electricity generation. And hydropower clearly has an added value and a value proposal in the overall electricity system to play. I'll end with just one question, and I think this is clearly a part. We are in the current situation, we have a choice and we need to have a choice and we need to take this opportunity. But the question clearly is, and I did not detail the investment into renewable energy, but unfortunately they show that we are not going in the right direction, not quickly enough. But the question is, where do we put the money? And this comes down to basically comparing the investment required to reach, for instance, the BNEF green, if we take the most ambitious scenario, the BNEF green scenario, where we need an annual investment of $1.9 trillion US. This means like this is annual during the next 8 years until 2030. And this is to be compared to the current investment in power and fuel of $366 billion US. So $1.9 trillion US versus $5.9 trillion US going into fossil fuel subsidies. And this is 2020 numbers. So with the current situation, the number will certainly increase. Thank you very much for your attention. Maybe just one thing to end on is we have a multi-stakeholder dialogue here ongoing because we also see that it is societal choices, market choices. And I invite basically all of you to join us in February for the next International Renewable Energy Conference that will take place in Spain, 20 to 23rd of February. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure there were quite a few. I certainly had a couple of questions that came out of that. So for those of you listening online, do please remember to use the Q&A to ask the speakers any questions, and we'll take those at the end. But thank you very much, Anna, for that intervention. Now, next speaker, I'm going to ask Yasmina Abdelilah to share her screen with us shortly. Now, Yasmina is an energy analyst for renewable markets at the International Energy Agency. And the International Energy Agency, of course, is an international energy forum comprised of 29 industrialized countries under the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation. And we, of course, know Yasmina very well, not least because of her in-depth analysis as part of the IEA's Special Market Report on hydropower. So with that, can I ask you, Yasmina, to take the floor? I confirm that I can see your screen.
Thank you, Pablo, and I want to thank the IHA for inviting the IEA here to speak today. So as Pablo said, my name is Yasmina Abdelilah, and I'm an energy analyst in the Renewable Energy Division at the IEA. And today I'm going to be presenting hydropower's role in the IEA's net zero scenario by 2050. So last year, the IEA published the Net Zero Report, which lays out a pathway for governments to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And we call that the net zero scenario. And what we see in that scenario is a massive increase in electricity in order to electrify the end uses that Rana just spoke about in terms of heating and transport, and to produce hydrogen, as well as meeting increased power demand. We're going to need electricity to increase by about 2.5 times in 2050 compared to today's levels. And while a majority of that needs to come from solar PV and wind, hydropower will play a major role as the third largest source of electricity generation in 2050. So that's its first role in the net zero scenario, is that hydropower is a major source of low carbon electricity generation, but that's not the only role that it will play. It will contribute significantly to the system flexibility that we need. Today, hydropower is one of the world's largest sources of system flexibility, on par with coal and natural gas, and it does this by being a dispatchable source of power, but also by providing really necessary ancillary good services and storage across multiple timescales. And by 2050, hydropower will continue to play a major role in providing system flexibility. We're going to need about 4 times as much capacity to integrate the rising shares of PV and wind that we just saw. And hydropower will play a major role of that by being the largest source of dispatchable power. So these are 2 roles that hydropower plays, providing low carbon power generation and system flexibility. In order to play those 2 roles effectively in the net zero scenario by 2050, as you heard, we need to double the installed capacity that we have today by adding about 1,200 gigawatts over the next 30 years, which is about 42 gigawatts per year. And so the next logical question that we ask ourselves is hydropower development on track to achieve this growth? And we looked into answering that last year with a special market report that we published dedicated specifically for hydropower in June of 2021. And what we did in that study is we went through over 140 countries, project by project, and we looked at their development pipelines over a 10-year period. And we estimated the commissioning dates of each project by looking at the market drivers and challenges that those projects faced. And what we found when we look over the next 9 years is a slowdown in hydropower growth over the next decade compared to the last 2 decades. And the reason for that is that we're seeing a contraction in development in major markets that were previously growing. The first is in China. We see a slowdown due to concerns over the environmental and social impacts, also less economically attractive sites. We also see slowdowns in Latin America, particularly Brazil, due to concerns over droughts, and in large hydro development in Turkey. Now, the slowdown does mask areas where we do still see growth in Asia Pacific, particularly from India and ASEAN, as well as sub-Saharan Africa, where, as you previously saw, there is still untapped economic potential there and rising power demand. So we're forecasting about 220 gigawatts of hydropower net additions by 2030, but what we need to be consistent with the net zero pathway is more than twice that amount. And so then what we did when we saw this gap is we went back to that project pipeline and we said, if governments address certain challenges, could we get more growth out of the current project pipeline? And the answer is yes, we can, about 40% more if we had an increase in access to affordable financing, if streamlined permitting existed, and if we had price signals for system flexibility. However, as you can see, that's still not enough to reach net zero. So what that means is that governments need to do more than just fine-tune the existing policies and regulations. They really need to increase the ambition for hydropower development. But new capacity isn't the only thing that's not on track by 2030. So is the investment in modernizing the existing fleet. By 2030, more than 20% of today's fleet is going to be over 55 years old. And that's the age in which a first major refurbishment is needed in order to keep those plants operating optimally. And so what we're seeing when we look at the current trends is about only $120 billion being invested to modernize the existing fleet. And what we need is more than twice that amount, about $300 billion in investment in modernization. And so we've got this investment gap. And the reason for that is that developers are facing challenges. One is that they're seeing limited visibility over revenue streams. They're also facing different regulatory environments that may have changed since that plant was first commissioned. So permitting can be more timely and more costly. So to summarize, hydropower plays two major roles in achieving net zero. It's a source of low carbon power generation, a major source of system flexibility, but there are two things that are not happening fast enough to help achieve net zero with hydropower, and that's a slowdown in development of new projects, as well as not enough investment in modernizing the existing fleet. And so to help governments address those challenges, we developed 7 policy recommendations. The first is to move hydropower up the energy agenda, make it a priority. The second is that to develop hydropower more sustainably. There are sustainability standards that exist, and if we utilize them, we could have faster permitting. The second is that governments need to recognize the role that hydropower plays in electricity security, and they can do this by reflecting that value through appropriate remuneration mechanisms. We can maximize the flexibility capabilities of the existing hydropower plants. In order to do that, we need to give appropriate price signals to incentivize modernization. And we can support the expansion of pumped storage. It is the largest, most cost-effective form of large-scale, long-term storage today. There's still untapped economic potential in developing economies. In order to utilize that, we need to mobilize more affordable financing. And finally, governments can take steps to ensure that the value of hydropower that it provides in terms of the multiple benefits is priced in. Hydropower provides more than just energy. It provides valuable water resources or services such as irrigation, navigation, and flood control. And when those are taken into account, it can really make or break the final investment decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was certainly thought-provoking, and I'm sure that there'll be some questions put in the Q&A as a result of it. Now, you mentioned pumped storage as one of the 7 points, and now I'm going to turn over to IHA Energy Policy Manager Rebecca Ellis to put the spotlight on pumped storage.
Thanks so much, Pablo, and thank you so much, Yasmina and Rana. I loved your presentations, and I've loved reading your various reports, and I look forward to digging more into those details. So just to get us started, one of the key sections actually in our hydropower status report this year is a spotlight on pumped storage hydropower. And our current total installed capacity for 2021 reflects some really important developments. We're still seeing China as a leader in this area. They, as part of 2021, they have stated an ambition from the National Energy Agency, an ambition to have 120 gigawatts installed pumped storage hydropower capacity by 2030. In addition, a number of projects were started development, either they became to their financial close, such as the Kidston Stage 2, which is going to make use of an existing mine, or we saw other developments such as in the US, there was a valuation guide. So to try and build up the build up more. And so what's really interesting in our current installed capacity is we're seeing more of this ambition in certain regions. So for example, India stepped up its ambition, and they're currently working on a storage policy that we hopefully should see published soon. And so that ambition is really exciting. And so whilst these numbers are 36 gigawatts for installed capacity for China, we expect that number to raise substantially in the coming couple of years. As IEA and Irene have noted, pumped storage makes up over 90% of global storage in their various renewable energy market reports. And we really do need that flexibility, that pumped storage, that dispatchable flexibility that's able to avoid curtailment, as Rana and Yasmina both touched on. So next slide, please. But as they both touched on, there's a gap there in terms of not just the ambition, but in terms of the recognition of pumped storage as a really critical tool for ensuring that we are able to have enough variable renewable energy, so to match the variable renewable energy and avoid curtailment where possible and be able to store that. So there's a very real risk that if you don't plan for this pumped storage need now, we'll be having problems in the future grid. And that's one of the main findings that we launched in September of 2021 as part of the International Forum on Pumped Storage Hydropower. So it was an 18-month initiative that brought together 13 governments, and it was led by the US Department of Energy. And we had co-chairs from the US DOE as well as Malcolm Turnbull. And so that concluded in September of 2021. And as part of that, there were 3 core working groups. And those were led by Voight Hydro, EDF Hydro, and GE Renewable Energy, respectively, and involved over 80 multilateral banks, research institutes, NGOs, and public and private companies. And it was a fantastic group to work with. And just to touch on, so one of the first findings was from the Sustainability Working Group. And as part of that, they did a real deep dive into the life cycle analysis. And in terms of saying, okay, what does this actually look like? And they did a multi-level approach, and they found, a multi-level approach is needed to assess the sustainability of pumped storage hydropower projects. But that existing tools, such as those that have been developed as part of the Hydropower Sustainability Standard, can be applied or the equivalent, but we strongly advocate for the Hydropower Sustainability Standard there. And that in addition to the sustainability standard, but you should also be considering non-powered benefits of PSH as part of those projects, and they should be considered in the overall sustainability profile of the project. So this can include community benefits, this can include water, so not just the power benefits of a hydro project, PSH project. And in addition to our sustainability working group, which was led by EDF Hydro, we had the capabilities, costs, and innovations working group. And this had 3 core deliverables as part of this. It included, this is led by Voight Hydro. And as part of this, there was an innovations deliverable, which highlighted 17 potential innovations in PSH, including saltwater PSH, making use of existing infrastructure such as mines or existing reservoir storage. And in addition to this, it found that energy storage and flexibility are increasingly needed, as others have touched on, and that PSH has a very high technology readiness level, or TRL, at 9, and that it already is providing key needs for balancing, and it will be even more important for the future planning. And so as part of this, in one of the second deliverables, to note, is part of the capabilities and costs working paper. This included a matrix that provided a comparison of various long duration energy storage technologies and showed the efficiency of round trip, and pumped storage has a very high round trip efficiency. It also has a low cost comparison when you compare it across the whole life. And so when you think about the simplistic capital expenditure of a project, a battery project to a PSH project, the lifetimes are very different. So a PSH project, the asset life is so much longer, between 40 and 80 years, depending on various factors. And so you can't just do simplistic capital expenditures, because a battery will last for 10, maybe 10 odd years. And so it can be misleading. And so it's important to consider the full life cycle, as well as it's considering your system needs. And so that gets into the Policy and Markets Working Group, which was led by GE Renewable Energy. And as part of that, there was one core paper, as well as 15 regional and country papers specifically. And so our core recommendations are very similar to IEA's, and many of those, and the strongest of which is assessing long-term storage needs now. We have a substantial need to increase our renewable energy and dispatchable renewable energy, such as pump storage hydropower, is a fantastic resource. And so it's very important when we're making our system plans is to ensure that as part of that, planning for long-term, long-duration energy storage. And we do that now, because sometimes larger projects take much longer to build. And ensuring that consistent technology neutral comparison will hopefully provide the most benefit to the community. In addition, it's very important, as Yasmina had touched upon in her presentation, remuneration is a very, very critical issue. So making sure that we have the right business case, because quite often the traditional paybacks for pump storage services are not being paid in the same way, just the lower cost or higher cost based on time of use. And so it's also important to ensure that remuneration is occurring for flexibility and essential grid storage services. Licensing and permitting need to be sped up where possible, but ensuring that we are as sustainable as possible, and long-term revenue visibility is really, really critical. So those are some of the key findings from the Policy and Markets paper, but there are so many fantastic regional and country-specific reports. Very highly recommend reading those. Those are all free to read and available on the IHA website. And so if we could go to the next slide. And as part of this, our activities, this includes a pump storage tracking tool. So we published the original tracking tool in 2019. But as a result of the findings of the International Forum on Pump Storage Hydropower, we've been working on an update which will take into account additional information. And this will include, for example, new projects. And we're very excited that there's a huge number of PSH projects in the pipeline that have been announced or under construction, et cetera. But as part of this, we also recognize the critical it's very critical that we start to track where governments are indicating their PSH targets. And so at the high level, this will include a PSH country level summary of national targets where we have them. And obviously not all governments will have those targets, but where we have them, we'd like to start tracking that because it's really critical to also compare it to the variable renewable energy targets. So next slide, please, Alex. And as part of this, there's a complementary goal. We're not competing against each other. We're actually all trying to ensure that there's enough renewable energy to balance the system needs. But this, as Yasmina touched upon, it's really, really critical to have that dispatchable capability. And so as part of this, where we have them, so for the 2030 targets, this includes for China 90 gigawatts. And so there's also a national renewable energy target. So we're going to start looking at this in more detail to try and ensure to sort of track that information. And that's something that we're going to continue to work on. But as Alex stated, there are so many projects in the pipeline, and it's a really exciting time for pump storage as well as reservoir and run-of-river hydro in general. So just to note that these are some upcoming exciting areas, and it's really important to track both variable renewable energy targets and pump storage. And I think that's everything from me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rebecca. So we've just heard, first we heard Alex talking to us about the status of hydropower, the hydropower industry. Then we had Rana talked to us about how the renewables revolution is still a pending project and something that's not just for hydropower, but throughout the renewables and the amount of work that's still pending there. We had Yasmina talk to us about what quoting Dr. Fatih Birol from the IEA, the need to awaken the forgotten giant of green electricity and how hydropower is the importance of hydropower, not just as a to produce energy, but also to support the growth of other renewables as well. and the need to not just wake up that forgotten giant, but really give him a big cup of coffee and a shot in the arm of steroids, because we really need to do quite a lot more to get that going. And then we had Rebecca talk to us also using pumped storage specifically as an example and as a spotlight, also stressing the urgency, the need to plan these things already now for the future, but also some optimism, at least when it comes to pumped storage, where we are seeing that things are changing somewhat. And we've had throughout the conversation today some points that have been coming up, and that also see reflected in some of the questions in the Q&A, things about sustainability, revenue visibility, etc. So now we're going to open up the Q&A for a few minutes. Before I do so, I have a question for Rana and Yasmina, if I can kick it off with that. You mentioned, Rana, the record addition in renewable hydropower, in renewable energies from solar and wind, for example, and you'd also mentioned the need to build on each other's strengths. And then Yasmina noted that the need to double hydropower growth, as well as give some useful points on why it's happened and why it's not happening. The question to both of you is, what can hydropower learn from other renewables in order to grow at the speed required? Is there something that wind and solar have done well, for example, that could be a lesson for hydropower that we can also incorporate in our collective work? Yasmina, I see you have your screen, your camera on. So if you want, maybe I could ask you to start.
Sure thing, Pablo. Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I would say that two things come to mind. And the first thing that has really helped PV and wind is that governments have given really clear, strong policy signals. They've set clear targets for that growth, and they've supported them with various types of policies to help stimulate that investment. I would say the second thing is an example of one of those policies, which is they've given very clear visibility over the long-term remuneration. So that gives the price signals and the certainty that investors need to make some of those long-term commitments. Hydropower has a lot of high upfront costs, and it really needs that certainty to stimulate that investment. So I would say those two things: really clear targets, ambition, policy support, and long-term visibility over revenue streams.
Thank you, Yasmina. Rana, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I guess maybe one part, and also because there were questions on the sustainability. I think from IHA side, you also underlined very much the sustainability that we're speaking about, sustainable hydropower, and I think there is an image question very much. And I think the solar PV and when we're speaking about admittedly very clearly, policy has been instrumental in driving solar PV and wind. What we also see, however, is that one of the advantages here is a certain decentralization, which also allows other players to join basically the game, so to say, whether it is cities, whether it's corporations, whether it is citizens. And these are fundamental in terms of building a societal acceptance of the energy transition too. And I think this is something which is really important to take into account also from the hydropower side, how to create basically the societal acceptance, how to create the trust basically that the social and environmental safeguards are really built into hydropower projects. Obviously, the discussion is very different when we are speaking about refurbishment basically of existing hydropower capacities or new hydropower capacities, but that's something to very clearly address. Another aspect here too is building basically business models that also allow corporations, citizens and cities to become an active part also from hydropower projects potentially, because for solar PV and wind, this is something which is much more easy. And then I would really like to build basically on this systems view of things, and what Rebecca also mentioned on the added value of hydropower in areas that are not directly linked to the power system, the energy system, but a broader economy. I think that is something which we observe more and more. It's very complex. It's also complex in solar PV and wind, But I take the example of solar PV for agriculture, for instance, everything which is agri-PV and the benefits, potential benefits, not only in the energy system, but also for agriculture, for building adaptation, etc., is something which is success stories and requires developing other narratives, but also building the business cases around this. And clearly hydropower has a real added value here, whether it is storage, whether it is a system, but also basically the flexibility. So the pricing mechanism are important, but also all the other benefits. And I think one benefit we did not speak about is the connection to the grids, because the grid infrastructure is fundamental here. And so we see it with floating PV, for instance, on hydropower basin. There is a real opportunity here with pump storage that is connected to renewable, whether it is PV or wind, or there are real possibilities to also build business cases on building on opportunity that solar PV built, offering a real, valuing the added value of hydropower to those technologies and developing a joint business case around, but also narratives, because this will really increase acceptance too. Sorry, very long.
but informative, so thank you. And I think we have a pretty good menu, I guess, of activities here that, of course, are quite helpful for us at IHA as well, as we try to think of how we help increase the voice of sustainable hydropower. Now, just want to touch on one point that you made, Rana, on the question of sustainability. And of course, just to make clear, last year in September of 2021, the Hydropower Sustainability Standard was launched, which of course is the only standard of its kind in the renewables, and of course it is a multi-stakeholder standard, which goes back to your point, Rana, about making sure that there's acceptance and community acceptance for hydropower. When we say that the only acceptable hydropower is sustainable hydropower, that's what we're talking about. How do we know that a project is sustainable? Well, there is a standard, a globally accepted standard, to determine whether or not a project is sustainable. And the better track record we can build on that, the better we can build the argument. So we take both parts, the communications element and the making sure that it's sustainable, but also then address some of the points that Yasmina made on the financial part. And I see that there's a couple of questions on financing in the in the Q&A. And before I go on to those, I do want to touch this question from Suvik Kamrui. Conventional hydro or pump storage project, which is better? Thanks. Well, that's a very broad question. And I'm looking forward to seeing how you're going to answer that one, Alex. Because I guess, yeah, there's going to be depends on what you look at, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I think Dean has asked a similar question about, on the environmental impact of pump storage versus conventional hydro. It really depends on the context of your electricity grid and your site and what you want the hydropower to do. If you've got a vast amount of water resource that's flowing consistently and you perhaps don't have high levels of variable renewables, then conventional hydropower will most likely make sense depending on the specific characteristics. If you've got quite a constrained environment, but but it is suitable for pump storage, and you've got a lot of excess energy generation, electricity generation, which historically would have been nuclear and coal, certainly in the case of Europe and Japan and China and North America, then it made sense to deploy pump storage hydropower. It really, it really is horses for courses, as we say in English. And just to pick up on the point on environmental impacts, I mean, well done hydropower should have quite limited environmental impacts for sure. But clearly, an off-river pump storage facility will have even smaller impact, and there are many cases where that might be the appropriate technology to deploy. And we've seen studies, for example, from the Australian National University, which was part of the work that Rebecca talked about earlier, which identified, 600,000 plus sites around the world. Now, this was a high level top down, an initial analysis, and of course those won't all be appropriate for all sorts of reasons, economic and social and what have you, but it gives you a sense of the scale, and the stored energy potential there was something like 23,000 terawatt hours, which is vast more than is needed today for sure, and would be more than enough to integrate 100% fully variable renewable electricity system in the future. So it's, as ever with hydropower, it's very much site specific, and you may find that conventional works better in one place and pump storage in another. And sometimes you can have a choice between the two. It really is context specific.
Thanks, Alex. And I guess the kind of the elephant in the room is going back to Yasmina's presentation and the slide that she had showing, even if we have that 40%, or if we do some improvements, we're still nowhere close to where we need to be. I guess the other part of this discussion is that, yes, that probably the case, but we're going to need both pump storage and conventional, and what we're going to need to do. So, there's quite a lot that needs to be built in hydropower moving forward. However, as has been mentioned again and again during this call, it needs to be sustainable, and it can be done sustainable. And if it's not done sustainably, then it shouldn't be built. But we are probably going to need all kinds of hydropower moving forward if we're going to reach a doubling. I see that there's some. Well, first of all, before we move on, Rebecca, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on pump storage, specifically on sustainability.
Just very much agree with what Alex said. And in addition to the ANU study, the Department of Energy in the United States has taken that a step further and done a more granular analysis of the ANU geoanalysis of potential. This is greenfield sites. These would be off-river, closed-loop greenfield sites in the United States, and so, and also the world. So they took it and they did an assessment of the US. But in addition to the greenfield sites, there are a number of opportunities for brownfield sites or making use of existing infrastructure. And this would be potentially low environmental impact because these sites are already in existence. There's a number of open air mines, and that Kidston Stage 2 is an example. It's one of the very first examples, and that one's actually being privately invested. So that's a really interesting opportunity as well, because it reached its financial closure in May of 2021, and construction has already commenced on that. And there are a number of projects around the world that are now looking into considering repurposing existing infrastructure such as mines. And so there's a fantastic opportunity to have low environmental impact, because these are just basically an upper reservoir and a lower reservoir. And I know, for example, in South Africa, they're considering it. And there's a number of other opportunities for greenfield and brownfield sites globally. So that's just something else to add.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And the point that you made about private investment is an important one. I see that there's also a question on the Q&A about financing pumped hydropower in Germany. And I think that what that tells us is that we need to do, well, we're not going to be answering that question here today, but it does suggest that there is something we need to be doing on showcasing some of these examples and making sure that that's available to the public. Rana, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, a very quick comment on what Rebecca said. I think this is indeed something which is also super important when we're speaking about the fact that we need to move out of fossil fuel into renewable energy. And here we very clearly have the possibility to also address areas and propose solutions in the just energy transition context, where it is about also creating opportunities for a fair transition, societal acceptance, job creation in, for instance, coal mining areas, and that is clearly something where there is also a narrative to build around it, so of clear societal interest too.
I'm afraid that's going to be about all the time we have for today, and it's a shame because now it's when we're actually getting to some of the good discussions. But what this says is that this is we've got some good ideas for us at IHA on some of the issues that we need to make sure that we address and that we get more information out. I want to can I ask Alex to please put up on the screen the last slide, because we have something that's really exciting coming up. But before I go into that, I want to really thank our panelists today, and for excellent presentations. I think we have a good understanding of what needs to happen and where we're struggling. But as our president often says, Roger Gill, we're struggling with the right things, and that's surely what we need to be doing. I want to close off by noting that on 11th of October of 2022 will be the first Global Hydropower Day, which will be celebrating the benefits of sustainable hydropower to people and communities around the world. Now, there's a website, hydropower.org/global day. Encourage everyone here to look at it and make sure that we take this opportunity to highlight some of the comments that have been mentioned during today's meeting, and to really make sure that we do awaken this forgotten giant, because if there's anything that come clearly out of this webinar today, it's that we have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure that we do meet net zero, and really there's no alternative. So we should take this with us and make sure that we do double capacity over the next 30 years. With that, once again, thanks a lot to the panelists. Thanks for excellent presentations. And do please stay in touch and make sure to stay engaged. And if you have any questions on anything that's been, any follow-up on anything that's been discussed today, do please reach out. Thank you once again, and have a great rest of the day.